Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. We are once again playing Street Fighter V on this Monday. We don't plan to switch over to Street Fighter 6 for our Monday lounges just yet. There are various reasons for this, but overall, we do have some interest in talking about things, especially since we did release bots yesterday. There were some technical push-through difficulties with that, but you're probably going to be able to have everything back to normal within the next week. And you can look forward to new bots, specifically Marissa and or DJ, being released for Street Fighter 6 next Sunday. This is probably going to be accompanied by or at the same time as our actual Street Fighter 6 streams, which for now will slot into the Sunday with everything time slot. Today though, since we are continuing with Street Fighter V, we're also going to be talking about how you can adapt to Street Fighter 6 even if you don't have the game yet. There are specific things that this game allows for that really push you forward, but there's no easy way to make sure that it's not going to be impossible to adapt. Depends on your character quite a lot. But we're already starting with two characters that do a decently good job of starting the explanation itself. And two players that can use this to train themselves.
Round 2. Fight.
Mostly I'll have things to talk about when these players are closer to the corner, but among the things you'll notice immediately when you pick up Street Fighter V versus 6 is the size of the characters on the screen. Street Fighter V characters don't take up anywhere near as much space on screen in normal situations, and this has basically been a thing that changed from game to game, depending on what style of play they wanted you to experience. Since Street Fighter 6 is trying to go back to a very specific style and make some additional changes, they chose the size of characters on screen most reasonable for that, let's say. But one of the things it definitely affects is how impactful certain things feel, even though they're not technically as impactful.
Round 1. Fight.
One of the first things people will teach you about Street Fighter 6 is that it's harder to become advantaged. You don't have as many plus moves. You can set up situations where you can get to them, but even that costs you more energy. This changes the defense game, but to make up for it, I guess you could say, they also added an option that you definitely have no equivalent of in this game on most characters. The Drive Rush and Drive Impact options. Drive Impact is functionally a better way of getting around having to do things in neutral. If you are spaced correctly, namely around the same spacing as most characters' jumps, you simply press two buttons and your character will move forward using a certain meter in order to armor through your opponent's attacks and hit them powerfully enough for a combo or crumple if they were grounded when you hit. In turn, you counter it by pressing your own, sometimes at the last moment, and it sort of works out similar to an anti-air. But since it's relatively limited, unlike a jump where you can just do it whenever you want, you will run out of energy to do this if you're not playing well. You can't just do it over and over forever. And since there's no cross-up involved, it's a little bit easier to defend against after a little practice than it might seem. This also means that, for the most part, jumps are slower and somewhat easier to anti-air in Street Fighter 6, and even if you land them, if they're blocked correctly, there's not necessarily strongly advantaged moves that the player jumping in and being blocked can use right after it. In terms of what this means you should practice, technically it means you should practice using footsies less. It can be a very footsie heavy game, but your opponent has what we like to call a neutral skip button. They press 2 buttons. Technically you can set it to 1 button, of course. And they'll be coming at you, armoring through your attempts at keeping them out with your own normals. And if you were doing anything that would prevent you from using your own to counter it, you're probably at least going to have to block it. When you do block it, you'll be pushed back. It's difficult to specifically beat this move by just blocking it. Once it's happened, depending on the character, you might have an option or two, but overall, you can't really do much. So today we're going to basically go through with the characters that have these options as their primary tools and talk about why you want to do them in Street Fighter 6 but don't necessarily want to do them as much in Street Fighter 5. The thing we worked out as the core thing to take away if you've already got the fundamentals of fighting games in general, the thing that makes Street Fighter 5 different and the thing that makes Street Fighter 6 stand out unto itself is what happens when the character gets to the corner. Because this is the game that makes the corner really different while not being the quote-unquote anime style game. In Street Fighter 5 there are definitely a few characters that have corner specific juggles and combos, but the flow of the match changes only in the sense that you might be able to keep your opponent there and get some advantages off of them not being able to backdash easily. Well, not backdash and get away from you. This goes on further in Street Fighter 6, but not necessarily in a way that correlates to 5 pretty much at all. And that comes out of the other thing that was previously mentioned. If you have difficulty becoming advantaged by pressing attacks, it means that the way you guard against someone when you are cornered changes slightly. Here, in 6, the player who is cornered can't do what they try to do here. They can't press a button that will make them plus advantaged in some way, and try to keep going from there. Because there are too few of those, and many of them don't reach very well. The attacker, on the other hand, could just drive impact to try to hit them and wall crush them, which will get them a good combo. So you have to be ready to jump out and not just be pressing buttons. Your opponent would armor through anything you did, basically, since almost all of the moves that actually hit enough hits in the short time available to break the drive impact don't seem to do that when you are cornered, for various reasons. There are a few that will still do so, but for the most part, because of the way that moves travel and hitboxes work, you usually can't just use the move and hope for the best. So, the player who is cornered has a lot of limitation in their options. But at the same time, the person who is on the offensive can't necessarily get that much either, since you can't use as many different hard to understand options. Most of the time, you only have one thing that will put you at extreme advantage, and you're mostly just hoping your opponent either is bad at defending against throws or really worries a lot. This isn't to say that you can't open them up just by finding the right technique to do so, but it's likely to be character specific or even player specific, whereas in this game, you basically just go, well, I'm going to just hit my button now, and since you can't backdash or easily get away from me, I get more options. What you're seeing our Kareen do though is the thing we expect most players to end up needing to do in 6. Rather than go for the pressure, which is at least somewhat less rewarding now, often you're going to want to move to the position where your opponent can do the least damage to you, but you can still be a legitimate threat to them. Especially if you have good options for whiff punishing. This is compounded even more by the fact that, in this game at least, when you want to use your EX moves, you need to have meter for them, which means if you've used up your meter on a super or something like that, you won't have the option for doing them at all. Whereas in Street Fighter 6 it's much more binary. You either have drive gauge and therefore can do EX moves, or you don't. You didn't interact with your super meter at all. And depending on which of your supers is invincible and what you can do with it, this means you have 2 different paths for using this sort of thing.
Let's do this.
Our bots are now somewhat focused on learning this mental transition from being able to attack to actually corner guarding. But since corner guarding in this game is slightly different, and most of the time you are better off going for pressure anyway,
11.
there's not a lot of pressure to be worked on from the bot side, and understanding how to increase your pressure isn't really important in the same way. Therefore, we ended up with one bot meant to teach you how to handle corner things from the side of you being trapped in the corner, and another bot meant to help you understand how to keep an opponent there without necessarily pressuring them. Even defensive opponents who don't really have to move. Specifically, Guile from the you are attacking side, and Ken from the you are defending side. I think Birdie's a little creepy looking when 11 transforms into Birdie specifically. But maybe that's just because I haven't seen a lot of 11 transformations in the first place. Alright, are they coming to life now? Nope, doesn't look it. In that case then, let's look at this from the other side. If Birdie is cornered, In this game, you're counting on the fact that he can't necessarily kill you super easily, especially if you had him use a lot of his meteor elsewhere. Even the press button and then cancel into the trigger has various ways to be tricked, dealt with,
You win.
and the person on the offense usually has some control over this, simply because they are the ones who are most likely to be advantaged in some way. But by removing all of the different things a player needs to learn
Round one.
in order to do it,
Fight.
you've shifted the situation around quite a lot. There they are, now they're alive. That's a good example. We're used to that just being the default. If you have the capacity to go for the meaty, you just go. And we've learned to accept either, okay, that worked, or my opponent beat me somehow. But this isn't necessarily a good habit to have even in this game, because it causes you to become over-focused on minor aspects. And that over-focus will generally put your opponent in the space where they only have to figure out the next thing you think is going to happen. What other changes we have are, for example here, where you tend to spend a lot of time really close to your opponent, instead of playing the footsies that this game is famous for, right? Understanding that you don't have to be there, though, can be a little bit rough to get used to, especially when it feels like the moment you let your opponent move somewhere, that they'll get advantage. But that, for example, was exactly what we're talking about. There was no need to do that. There's no need to be this close either. It ends up feeling that way because that's the style of game you think that Street Fighter V must be. But it isn't a must-be thing. It's just the way that the game tends to work, because it's hard to feel like you're going to make it yourself if you don't do something. So, by shifting the design of 6, they've basically told a bunch of players out there, no, you have to learn how to corner guard correctly. You have to learn how to understand where to stand instead of understand which button to hit on your opponent's wake-up. And this allows you to dial back the speed of the situation somewhat. And if you're a player who just likes hitting buttons a lot, or your character does, probably the game has offered you a couple of options to be a little bit better than just, okay, well, I don't get to do anything and I just have to guard. Backdashing, for example, is usually good enough, and understanding that you just don't have to chase certain opponents at all because they don't have enough demonstrated skill at beating you is also a shift, because you can get more out of your drive gauge and you benefit more from moving forward than you do from moving backwards. Similar to the tension meter in Guilty Gear.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Because of this, there's a lot to be said for the learning how to just walk people to the corner with whatever skill you've got.
Safe at you.
And here's a matchup that demonstrates that really well. Karine doesn't need to fight Lucia basically at all in the way that most people interact in this game. She can go under most of Lucia's fireballs and setups with good enough timing, She avoids a large part of Lucia's kit other than one move that is the one Lucia should generally be using. And she even has ways to beat that one. Lucia generally needs to space herself really well and surprise Karine in some way, but if you get a little bit too timid about it, you'll end up walking yourself to the corner, and Karine doesn't have to do anything, she just walks forward. Lucia tends to walk backward, and it's only becoming overzealous or not being ready to react to things Lucia risks doing that really matter. Fortunately for Lucia, Karine doesn't actually do a lot of damage when she's in that mental state. You'll see it's about that much. She has to do that so many times. So it tends to be a very long matchup. They're both just slowly poking their way forward. Because Karine doesn't take a lot of damage from anything Lucia does if she's playing this way either. This does a decent job, therefore, of simulating what Street Fighter 6 feels like when you don't have enough drive meter to do much of anything. When you've got enough gauge, you can get a lot done if you've got the execution for it, and your opponent doesn't have the clarity of mind, that say, to figure out what will come next. It's good for surprising people, but people who are too prepared are just going to make you waste all of your drive gauge and burn yourself out without actually getting anything out of it or opening them up. This is partially why the game actually is much more damage and there's a lot more interaction happening. Here, for example, none of that was required. Not the things that happened on screen, rather, but making sure that you have done enough damage is not a key factor in this matchup. You just walk forward and recognize that your character has the option to do that. This comes up in fighting games a lot, knowing my character has this option and you don't have really anything you can do about it. But in many games, that option tends to be a lot more aggressive, a lot more button or attack. In Street Fighter 6, it's a lot more, I can stand here and nothing you do will hit me in time. I will react to almost all of it. Adding the drive impact just adds another tool that someone can use to get the I could react to you trying this outcome. Similarly, the jumps have become more reactable as a result of it. Karine gets a lot of control in this matchup, mainly because Lucia's longest strike that actually bothers her is her overhead. And getting the spacing for the overhead to be effective is relatively hard. Plus, obviously, like everything else we're talking about here, it doesn't do that much damage. But this is actually quite similar to Street Fighter 6 because if you aren't doing a lot of damage because you're using normal moves all the time, it's something that you just have to adapt to as you go, rather than getting a big setup and hoping that you'll win from that big setup. Even the supers in the game, which do a lot of damage, the setup required in 6 for them isn't usually too high. You can react to people with them, you can ignore that and end combos with them in order to get the opponent to the corner faster, and having got them to the corner faster, you'll end up back to the situation we were talking about before.
It's go time. Let's do this.
If you're a fan, you could probably predict what these two players play in Street Fighter 6, but in case you can't guess, maybe it's not as obvious where Omni Rabbit goes in that choice. You will in fact be seeing in future Cammy versus Kimberly. And the difference between this matchup and Cammy versus Kimberly is basically that Kimberly has a better stand medium kick. And that's about it, actually. The reason it turns out so much the same is just that if you are trying to play the mid-range with the two characters, the way they collide in a game that has no priority system tends to be the same. Overall, when Lara and Karine are trying to really hurt each other, even though they don't use the same inputs, a lot of the ways that they do their moves and the spacings they want to be at turn out the same. To the point where they both have the same structure to the fighting them that we always tell people. Just neutral jump. If you think they're going to approach neutral jump, because it's unlikely that whatever move they have to react to the neutral jump is actually going to help them if they're not really primed for it. Karine's uppercut, rather EX for Senha, doesn't actually reach that space all that well, and similarly, Lara's heavy bolt doesn't either. They can both certainly hit a normal and hope that the hitbox works out, but you generally don't expect that at that range. You just neutral jump because you think your opponent has decided they're coming for you. And Kimberly versus Cammy is very much the same thing. But what if you decided to not do that, to not actually try to approach and to only play neutral? That's where we get the big change. We have Onryabbit going from a character that generally can't hit at this range and is pushed back or somewhat controlled by Karine's stand medium kick, to a character that has approximately the same range, and now they're both trying to figure it out. But Cammy has received some design changes that will help. Basically, she got an even longer, further kick. And her stand heavy punch, relative to this game, was shifted to go forward and get a target combo.
Final round. Fight.
Fortunately, for Omni's side, this doesn't actually result in reset back to this situation. Mostly because Kimberly's tools are very complicated, and she can use them to get around Cammy's buttons altogether, sometimes. And of course the other part is that we've got the drive impact, and since she doesn't need a lot of EX moves, similar to how Lara doesn't really do EX moves in this matchup, she'll tend to have a lot of meter available. When she does use it, it's at moments like that, for a big surprise, but this isn't something you use to control space or to set up the match the way you want it. And Kimberly has a lot of similarities in that way. She has them for combo enders if you really want to use it there. But a lot of the time, against a character that has good coverage with their buttons and good speed, even Kimberly's EX, we'll call it teleport, even her EX teleport isn't really something you need or want to use. You can manage enough against the opponent without using it because of range, in the Cammy matchup, let's say, that you don't actually care. But it does mean that you can decide, okay, I'm not playing footsies right this moment, I would prefer to move forward, I'm going to drive impact. And because you are at that footsie range, it's much more likely that the opponent is not, in fact, going to even neutral jump it. Because we don't generally see the neutral jump in footsies range here. People go for the footsies and see what they can get done. Which is why we end up with these neutral jumps that don't seem to have a purpose because the other person just happened to not come forward after all. Drive impact is definitely not the new neutral jump in that scenario at all. You should still just neutral jump and hope for the best. but it's less likely that the opposing character will need to use that sort of skill to get in to begin with. Normally, they use an attacking move to advance, simply so that they don't have to worry about it when you press a button to stop them. But here, where those moves can be checked, is very different from 6, where the move might be a drive impact and can't be checked, other than by the opponent using their own.
Let's do this.
That's how you start the fight and finish it quickly.
Loud. Round 1. Fight.
Let's see what you've got. Ding ding! I took this round.
Round 2. Fight.
One of the relatively advanced functions of choice in terms of which attack to use, particularly normal attacks, hasn't changed though. Pushback. In this case, normally what happens is that pushback is part of what people call frame traps, making sure that you have done an attack that your opponent can't easily counterattack, especially those that you set up an entire whiff punish. You did an attack, your opponent feels I should hit you, but you've set it up somehow such that the hit will whiff due to range, and you will then get to use your own attack. Sometimes you don't even have to wait to actually start your own attack, just because you can do it, and the attack you use to start doesn't have a far enough forward hurt box for whatever they want to hit to damage you.
Round 1.
This comes up in this matchup often enough that it's worth learning, but we don't expect it to come up in the 6 matchup between Kimberly and DJ as often. We'll have more to say about what you need to learn against DJ when we release the bot, but for now, the main thing you need to understand is that the character isn't actually that tricky despite it being mentioned that he's supposed to be. Most characters who have that tricky designation are more so confusing. They look like they can't be hit, but often there's a really simple way to hit them. In DJ's case, you basically hit him in the face. Because he doesn't use too many crouching moves that actually lead into anything, as long as you're willing to take the damage from the crouching attack he does, particularly if your attack button that you're using in the case of trying to hit him in the face is actually close to his neck level, you'd say, then you're just going to win. He has definite options to beat these buttons, but it is a lot more work from his side because it's practically different for every character, and shifting to do that allows those characters to use all their tools rather than having to worry about DJ actually managing to trick them. Fortunately, tricky characters do have a reason they're called that. Once they get control of a situation, they can do a lot more things. They don't have to be relatively straightforward, and therefore you will probably get tripped up at some point based on some option they have. Whereas Laura, as an example, has to spend a lot of energy to be tricky, in most cases just having to find the right spacing to set it up so that you will block long enough to get caught by EX Sunset, for example. Or things like that.
Laura wins.
Being spacing and execution heavy to get your tricky attacks isn't as helpful when your opponent has a single button solution. And that's going to put him at somewhat of a disadvantage in the game because everyone has a single button solution. It's called Drive Impact. At least in DJ's case though, he can make you think it's time to use that and then respond with his own. And certainly he can use his own to get around the very obvious kick him in or punch him in the face strategy, while not really needing his meter for much else. So we're expecting the character to still be effective, but tricky might be a little bit of a misdirection in itself. Seeing Luke in this game, particularly in this, let's call it skin, is a real change because he plays quite differently in 6. Not necessarily because 6 itself influences how Luke plays. If anything, it's the opposite. You can tell to an extent that Luke was a character made to be played in Street Fighter 6's style and engine. And honestly, by bringing him to this game and giving him certain frame data, he became a little too strong in specific ways for a while.
Round 1. Fight.
By most standards, he's still too strong. And the lag, which I'm sure can't be any better on that end, will not be helping. But the thing you have to understand about Luke is that, especially in Street Fighter 5, there's nothing explicitly scary about this character. He's scary when you need to beat him. He's scary if he has the life lead and basically at no other time. Because he's, like certain other characters, quite good at destroying you if you make an error, but doesn't actually do anything if you don't make those errors.
Round 2. Fight.
In fact, not pushing too hard on him is usually a good plan simply because it causes him to have less meter. And the less meter he has, the less effective he generally is. It's similar to fighting Fang in that way, where you kind of want to beat him. But doing too much work to actually achieve this is probably not in your best interest. He's not really a zoner either. He's not good enough at it under most circumstances. But he is good enough at putting himself in this space where you feel the need to get to him. Even though, let's say here, when you're playing Laura, life leads are not real. But every time you see Omni Rabbit go for the sway to get closer, it's failed. Because it's designed to fail. There's no benefit to this, because Luke will always be moving. And he will always be avoiding the situation. This fight would have turned out exactly the same had Omni done none of that. Except that this part would have been less risky. But again, this doesn't mean Luke is specifically a bad character in this game. It's a matter of understanding why you don't have to care about things. in turn was, at least to their credit, given a move that makes you really feel like you need to care. Sandblaster is an incredibly good annoyance poke to give people the feeling, well, I should probably do something about this move, or he's just going to keep on poking me with that forever. The problem with this is that Luke isn't necessarily very good at doing anything other than Sandblaster once he starts. And if you get enough of a life for you to get anywhere, or have any decent anti-zoning tools, then he doesn't really get to do anything. Particularly in laggy situations, your best bet is to not actually care about the Sandblaster at all, because unlike many characters who have a way to set up something or at least get a little bit of movement after their projectiles, Luke stands there for the entirety of Sandblaster. He just punches out just like a really long button. It's very similar to fighting Dalsim, except that this Dalsim can't teleport.
It's go time. Let's do this.
And so we go back to the beginning with our less experienced fighters to discuss how you can improve your Street Fighter 6 skill without necessarily playing Street Fighter 6. If you only got 5, you only want to play 5, you realize that 6 is going to be a miserable experience until you've practiced all your combos because someone changed your character's entire combo route and structure. Not that I'm bitter about it or anything. You still have paths where you can at least do the mental side of the game. And these two, as we always mention, this match is almost entirely about who gets to the corner first.
Round one.
Meaning that these two players, have a really good option for training for those things before they go anywhere near Street Fighter 6 in a serious way. They also fight as if they're already close to the corner because neither of them wants to give an inch of ground. The moment they actually get there, things will be much worse, so see that's the problem. Yet they both have entirely effective invincible uppercut options, meaning that if you were to just decide, well, I'm going in now that I have control in the corner every time, eventually you will get hit by that, no longer have control, and things will be complicated. But a moment ago you probably saw what is the biggest difference between the two games. Arnikali simply stepped forward a tiny bit and did crouch medium punch twice, getting enough pushback, but also creating a situation that Lucia couldn't necessarily strongly challenge. It's risky to challenge it because Nikali is advantaged as soon as the first crouch medium punch hits. This means you have enough advantage to push your opponent to where you want them just by pressing your own basic button string. And 6 is a lot less helpful in this way. The player who is being poked at has more options. Even if those options themselves don't necessarily lead to big damage, the situation is changing. The style of the game is changing.
Nikali wins.
To train this in 5, therefore, simply work more on your corner guard. You can use our Nash bot, who is good for autopilot, but also does good work as a corner guard training partner. You trying to make sure that he doesn't leave, and
Round one.
mentally stacking up all the different reactions you might need to have. But he's also not a character who's super good at getting into that same situation Kali just did, pressing buttons and therefore having advantage. He definitely has options like this, but they're not usually options that he can just choose to do suddenly. And therefore you don't have to stand as far away from him. You stand wherever your character benefits the best. There are not many characters in the game who are disadvantaged by standing at their optimal range against Nash, because he just doesn't have the moveset or move types that will help him just skip neutral and get out of the corner. But since you must train your reactions so high to make sure that you have control, he at least has moves on that level. Moves where the speed of the game that you need to react to can be at the borderline. You might not be able to do it without training. Whereas here, you don't really have the option in the first place. Once the Kali's crouch medium punch has touched you and you were blocking, there's no more reacting to do. The only thing you'd be reacting to is what the Kali happens to choose to do next, which could be any number of things. But you don't get to go, well, because I blocked this, or because I was spaced correctly, my opponent has no choice but to try something else that I might be able to react to. Nash is like that. You can say to yourself, Nash only has options that I could react to because I blocked this thing, or because I moved to this thing. And this applies to, as far as we know, every character in the game. In Street Fighter 6, therefore, we expect to see less of the, I'll just walk forward and hit jab. I'll walk forward and hit light kick, as solutions to being cornered. And then you can just stack everything else on top of that. The first step most people take, once they've realized, I probably shouldn't just try to walk forward to you and hit an advantaged move, is that they'll expect that you, having seen the situation, are going to come in for the attack, and they'll go for something invincible or a crush counter option, a big heavy swing that then might beat your quicker attack, and is often safe enough that they can afford to hit it, as long as it will be blocked or manage the crush counter. But the crush counter itself is based on the idea that there is a priority system in the game. You want to pressure people with, often, your medium attacks, but if they press their heavy attack and the two collide in their active frames, the heavy attack just wins. There's no specific thing that you can do to prevent this other than using specials instead of normals. Once the heavy attack has won, usually by the full crush counter, the person who hit it is fully advantaged. They got out of the corner by basically going, I think you're coming for me, so I'm just going to hit my heavy kick. Especially if the spacing was good enough that the heavy kick itself won't be punished.
Lucia wins.
This obviously isn't true for every character, but it's true enough for most characters that it shifts the way people think about Street Fighter V, the game.
Round one.
Similarly, if you manage to get your opponent to the corner and burnt out, you might not be able to say, I can't be hit by invincible moves because you won't know if they're going to super or not. But you can say with some certainty, I'm not going to get stopped by drive impact. And if you aren't going to be stopped by 5 impact, then you do get some options for pressing buttons in similar ways. Your opponent therefore isn't going to hit a heavy just for the sake of maybe beating you. They may not be able to use things like invincible uppercuts without CA gauge, and even if they did have super gauge to do anything with, a lot of the time the super won't reach, or in certain spaces isn't even invincible enough to matter. And their jumps are usually reactable. So if you spend your time understanding and trying to learn how do I control people who I've managed to corner without overextending myself, you're likely to have a lot more success and probably even more fun in Street Fighter 6 than you even can have in this game. Some characters do have really advantageous matchups for the corner guard situation here, but it's not as universal as it can be there. Similarly, it's harder to read the situation in a lot of cases. Since everything goes in the opposite direction. If you fear your opponent using their meter, you don't want to stand close enough. But if you don't stand close enough and they step forward and don't actually activate anything metered and invincible, then they're going to tap you with an advantaged move and probably set up a situation where they get out of the corner anyway.
Let's do this.
That basically concludes what we have to say about the game, as Street Fighter 6 is going back to basics in a way that doesn't generally require you to learn a lot of techniques to play. It is what people have been clamoring for, or at least some subset of people have been clamoring for. And it's always a good idea to make a separate game when you're moving forward, simply because everyone who prefers Street Fighter V will just keep playing Street Fighter V for a while. The same thing happened with Street Fighter 4, except that there doesn't seem to be as much of a push at the moment, but that usually takes a couple more days. So we'll probably be hearing in the next few days about all the reasons why Street Fighter V might have been somehow better. I don't expect as much of it though, because Street Fighter V can't easily claim to be better. It can only claim to be more. There's more to learn, more to track, and so on. If there's a complaint about 6, I really expect it's going to be that it's kind of flat, that after a while there isn't a lot to learn or to do. But for the combo fiends out there, I'm sure they're going to find things to do anyway. I'm more so thinking about the players who tend to play these games casually. Once you've got it down, you're either definitely not going to keep winning because there's not much to use, or you will probably just give up anyway, because even if you did find a way to win, it probably isn't going to be to your taste, let's say. It goes back to the very interesting era of fighting games where your capacity to get good enough to keep winning was more related to how much you were enjoying playing in the first place. Whatever that means. You can contrast this if you are familiar with our DNF Duel content with that game's general flow. Even though it is basically dead now by most standards, it had a very different style to that. You could learn to play DNF, not be particularly enjoying the process of playing DNF, but somehow it would cause you to keep on getting better anyway. I certainly can't say that a game that you can get better at while not enjoying it is a particularly good design. So I don't specifically have a point there other than the fact that 6 is explicitly aiming to not be that. If you like playing it, you will probably get better at it. And if for whatever reason you don't like playing it, it may be a little bit more difficult to get better because the things that you can do, the things that make your character effective, aren't likely to be things you get to do regardless of opponent. This game is a lot more likely to be a learn this matchup and see what you enjoy about it than learn this character and see what you enjoy about them. For pro players, those differences aren't much. They tend to have similar experiences either way, which is good for them, obviously. But for those of us who are still working on getting somewhere near their level, either for tournament reasons or just to enjoy the game more, you might find it a little bit more of a push. And it seems we're ending on a matchup that lets me talk through as an ending, because there isn't a lot to say about how to fight Helene on Nikali. Technically, these two characters are the opposite of what we've been talking about all stream. They kind of just move around each other altogether. Neither of them has any direct goal that actually interacts with the other's goals. They have counters for the other's strategies, but neither one is specifically easily equipped to automatically stop the goal of the other. And so, I don't find myself with a whole lot to say about it. This is mostly going to come down to whoever's not ready to do a specific counter. Or doesn't have their punishes quite on deck enough. As noted on our Twitter, 2_MK_FGC, we have released 4 bots, Guile, Ken, Jamie, and Ryu, with different purposes. None of which are matchup related directly, but you will get some matchup knowledge out of fighting them. Since they spent so much time on making dynamic and modern controls work, they also had to do a lot of checking of new spacings and specific things for characters from the AI side, meaning that you're probably going to get a much better experience out of fighting the CPU now. And simply by adding specific tools to all players and characters, CPU included, you're likely to have a stronger experience overall. The CPU no longer has to rely on doing things that a player can't react to, doing things that a player couldn't do in most situations due to reactions, or anything like that. It'll just have options like using Drive Impact, and you'll probably just have to deal with it. It also doesn't have to quote-unquote worry about the fact that it shouldn't perfectly get out of all your cool block strengths, because that would be how you would deal with it in this game. You'd make the CPU just always get out of whichever trick, but that would feel really cheap. Whereas in 6, since those mostly don't exist the same way, you can get away with letting them get out of it, and you can also set up situations where they would need a resource that they aren't likely to actually have to get out of it at all. So do try to use the CPU, particularly level 7 or 8, in the same way that you use the ones here, the ones we recommend you actually use for this game. And the bots will, of course, aim to give you whatever the CPU basically can't give you, and improve your overall play by giving you the same situation over and over again, without you having to worry that you got countered because the system understands how to counter you. Bots don't understand how to counter you, even if sometimes it feels like it. That brings us to the end of this Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. You can continue to expect us to have these in the coming weeks on Monday as usual, and our Street Fighter 6 content will probably be some other day, with the best option being Sunday at the moment. Of course, you can still join us for King of Fighters, a Feeling Thursday on Thursday, and most likely this guidance on Friday for Marissa and DJ. Most likely, you will not get any Tuesday or Wednesday content from the channel, simply because we'll probably be working on finalizing bots and fixing the website, whatever small issues remain with it. You can find the bots therefore at 2-mk.org. We're still doing redirects and shifting things around in URLs. You should probably be able to find them all at sf6-bots. But if you have any issues with navigation, of course, the homepage will probably give you menus that you will go to whatever you want to with. Some of the videos for other bots may be broken at this time, but we believe we fixed all of the actual bots for all of our other games. Therefore, before this match actually starts, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.